Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the challenge of saving India's tigers, with expedition leader Aditya Panda. Aditya, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Colby. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm back with another presentation from India. For those of you who are listening to me for the first time, let me introduce myself. My name is Aditya Panda, and I have been leading Nat Hab's India expeditions since 2016. Today, I'll be presenting on a topic that is closest to my heart, the conservation of tigers. We have often discussed about tigers on many webinars in the past, but they have mostly to do with the natural history and safari side of things. Today, we'll go a little deep into the conservation issues and challenges that tigers face in India. Before I start, Colby, may I request you to turn my webcam off so that I save on bandwidth, and then we can later have it on again during the Q&A session. Thank you, Colby. A lot of people wonder why there is so much fuss about the conservation of tigers, and probably not as much on many lesser known species. Well, here's why. The tiger is what you would call a flagship or an indicator species. It is the top carnivore of any ecosystem that it occupies. In the Indian subcontinent, it is the natural top predator in most terrestrial ecosystems. For this reason, it has been chosen as a target species for conservation. A healthy tiger population is the shortest indicator of a healthy ecosystem. A failing tiger population is the first warning of a failing ecosystem. After the top carnivore is gone, ecosystem collapse is usually rapid and affects all other species occupying it. That apart, there's a direct correlation between tigers and water. India's tiger reserves are the source of over 500 perennial streams and rivers. Virtually every river in India that either originates in a tiger forest, or if it happens to be of Himalayan origin, it benefits from flowing through the watershed of a tiger forest. That apart, functioning ecosystems are crucial to rural livelihoods. So tiger conservation has a direct role to play there as well. The tiger is also a national and cultural icon for India. It's India's national animal, and it has tremendous brand value, so to say. Also, if you ask me why tigers need to be conserved, personally, I think they need to be conserved simply because they're there. Now, this is something I've often discussed in past webinars. India is the tiger's greatest bastion. It is home to over 70% of the world's last living wild tigers. India has long been a global leader in tiger conservation and is home to 3,000 tigers approximately. There are over 52 tiger reserves in India. There are 52 notified tiger reserves as of now, and there are many more in the pipeline, and this number constantly keeps growing. That apart, we also have a large network of wildlife sanctuaries and national parks spread across the country. India also has some very strong conservation policies and legislation, and there is also tremendous popular support for tiger conservation. That apart, besides the government, there are multiple agencies involved in the conservation of tigers, including non-government organizations and individuals, institutions, etc. These are the reasons why India has today become the tiger's greatest bastion, while tiger populations across most other tiger range countries have been struggling to survive. But this wasn't always so. Up until the 1960s, tiger hunting was a very, very popular sport in India. One of the reasons why tiger numbers went down so much is in fact because they were hunted indiscriminately throughout the 20th century, the first half of it especially. It is estimated, rather guesstimated, that in the year 1900, there must have been about 100,000 tigers across India. And these tigers were hunted indiscriminately throughout the period of British colonial rule in India. And after independence, which was shortly after World War II ended, tiger hunting became a major foreign currency generator for the then newly independent country of India. Tiger hunting trips were advertised even by the government of India. And in the 1960s, a lot of wildlife lovers, even former hunters, began to get very worried about the fate of the tiger in India, because by then it had started to become very clear that unless something is done quickly, the tiger would be hunted out into extinction. At that period, the then Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who herself was a naturalist, took some very strong decisions that changed the fate of wildlife in India. In 1968, tiger hunting was banned, and even the export of tiger skins was banned. An all India tiger census was undertaken in 1970. Back then we did not have the technology of today that involves DNA sampling and camera trapping. So the tiger census in 1970, all the way until 2004, in fact, was carried out using tracings and plaster casts of tiger tracks, which were believed to be as individual to each tiger as human fingerprints. And from the shape of these individual tiger tracks, tiger numbers were estimated. Anyhow, that technology is now considered extremely outdated and unreliable. But in 1970, that was the best bet. And in the first All India Tiger Census in 1970, it was found that there were less than 1,800 tigers surviving in India. In 1972, the Wildlife Protection Act was passed by the Indian Parliament, and this act outlawed all kinds of hunting, and it led to the establishment of several wildlife sanctuaries and national parks across the country. In 1973, India launched a project called Project Tiger. Now, this project started with 9 tiger reserves that were, areas with high potential of tiger conservation that were identified across 9 different landscapes. And these were meant to be nurtured as source populations where, tiger conservation would be first priority. And it was expected that tiger populations in these reserves would revive and grow and then spill out into adjoining landscapes, helping in reviving the tiger population across different kinds of habitats and across the country. This is called the source and sink concept. Now, in 1973, India was still a very economically challenged third world country that had recently come out of out of colonial rule, and Project Tiger was at that time considered the world's most ambitious species conservation program. So it was quite an audacious move for a newly independent country to undertake. And India at that time did not have the financial means to undertake such a project on its own. So WWF played a huge role in not only providing funds but also training and capacity building of India's forest officers to be able to start this project successfully. Today, the number of tiger reserves has grown from 9 to 52. And as I mentioned a little earlier, that number is constantly on the rise. And Project Tiger is considered one of the Government of India's most successful and longest running projects. So what do tigers need? Why is their conservation so challenging, and what do tigers need to survive? Well, like a lot of us do a lot of times, tigers need space. They are large carnivores and they are large ranging carnivores, which means they need a tremendous amount of space to survive in, and they need large undisturbed and contiguous tracts of habitat in which to live in. That apart, they need core areas which have high quality habitat and are free of human habitation, in which tigresses can breed successfully and tigers can exist in high density breeding populations. Now, these populations inevitably will outgrow the size of these core areas and spill out, and younger animals will need to disperse out of that habitat, looking for other habitats and other populations to be part of. For this reason, these tiger habitats need corridors that connect them to each other. Besides habitat and space, tigers need a lot of prey. Now, the average tiger kills about 50 deer-sized animals a year to survive. And to sustain that sort of offtake, you need a base population of about 500 deer-sized animals for a single tiger to survive. So, you need really high quality habitat free of human habitation, and very well protected habitat to sustain that kind of high density prey base. And again, these animals need to be medium to large sized ungulate prey, such as the spotted deer that you see on your screen, or the largest sambar deer, as well as wild pigs. Now, statistically, when we say we need 500 deer-sized animals per tiger, it doesn't mean, say that, for example, you have the muntjac or barking deer, which is much smaller than a spotted deer. So you can't say that you have 1,000 muntjac in a forest, for example, and you can expect tigers to survive. It doesn't work that way. Tigers need a minimum size of prey for their hunting to be efficient and for them to get enough nutrition. Besides habitat and prey, tigers need protection. Here you see some forest guards along with a park elephant, a rather young elephant, in the Kaziranga Tiger Reserve in northeastern India. These people are out on patrol, and they have to be, because tigers, their prey and their habitat need a lot of protection. There is always the threat of tiger poaching, of course, and there is also the constant pressure of the poaching of deer and wild pigs, which is called bushmeat poaching. That apart, there are always such threats like the encroachment of habitat by people living around these reserves, habitat destruction through the collection of firewood, illegal timber felling, besides also livestock grazing and then there is also the constant threat and increasing problem of tigers getting into conflict with people. So what are the challenges that prevent us from providing these three basic things that are required for tigers to survive? Well, the first I would say is the degradation and encroachment of habitat. This has been one of the oldest issues with tiger conservation. There is always a demand for illegal timber felling, and since tigers live in, the majority of tiger habitat is moist and dry deciduous forests, which have a lot of high quality timber trees, there is always the threat of habitat being destroyed by timber felling. There is also the issue of firewood collection. A lot of people in rural India still depend on firewood collection for cooking, and there is also a market for charcoal made out of firewood collected from forests. That apart, a lot of people depend on other forest produce such as honey, fruit, resins, even the collection of a lot of different kinds of leaves for various purposes, and also the collection and sale of medicinal plants. There is also the threat to habitat from encroachment by fringe villages, that is, villages that are present on the fringes of forests and tiger habitats, as well as villages that happen to exist within these habitats. This sort of encroachment can be done very slowly and quietly by, say, girdling trees on the peripheries of villages so that they die out, and over time the area occupied by the village is expanded, and the area under agriculture is increased by encroaching into the forest. An even greater threat and an increasing threat in the India of the 21st century is the enormous increase in large and linear infrastructure. Now, India is a country of nearly 1.5 billion people. Estimates range from 1.4 to 1.5 billion people. The latest All India population, the estimation of people, the census hasn't been able to be carried out because it was due this year, and due to the COVID pandemic, the exercise hasn't been carried out. But according to the last census, which was in 2011, India had over 1.2 billion people, so that number is expected to have increased. And with such a large population and a developing country that has been trying hard to grow at double-digit GDP growth, the greatest change that you see on the ground is the massive expansion of infrastructure. This map here shows you just how many roads and highways and railway tracks are coming up in just a small section of tiger habitat in the central India tiger landscape. Now, this is true for all of India. Linear infrastructure, that is quite literally infrastructure that is in a straight line, such as roads, railway tracks, canals, dams, etc., is a huge challenge to keeping tiger landscapes intact. They fragment tiger landscapes, and they prevent not just tigers but a lot of other animals from being able to migrate from one patch of habitat to another patch of habitat. And of course, they also lead to a lot of road kills and train kills of highly endangered species. and they lead to the isolation of populations, which is always fatal in the long run. Of course, there are now efforts to try and overcome these by having overpasses and underpasses in all new highways that are coming up, but these passes aren't 100% effective. The largest such overpass across the tiger corridor in central India, for example, has successfully been documented to be allowing animals to cross underneath it. But there have also been cases where animals like leopards and even tigers have still managed to get onto the highway and have been trapped, by the high barriers on either side that are used to soundproof these highways. So this massive expansion of infrastructure is a very, very serious threat to the future of the tiger in India. Another huge challenge, and one of the most destructive ones when it comes to tiger habitat, is the large-scale mining of minerals such as iron ore, bauxite, and fossil fuels like coal that occurs especially in eastern central India, which is the part of India that I am from. Now, these land use practices like mining require vast expanses of forest to be denotified and handed over to mining companies, and for this reason they have to undergo a lot of environmental scrutiny, of course, and due to political reasons, there is almost a deliberate move to try and keep areas that have high mining potential, in less than optimum condition for wildlife, in order to get easy clearances later. And some of the largest tracts of tiger habitat have been destroyed because of this sort of large-scale mining. Now, this photograph is one that I took about a decade back while I was in an area that is outside of the protected area network. This wasn't in a reserve, but in what we call a reserve forest, which is a lesser level of protection than, say, a wildlife sanctuary or a national park. I was out there on a wildlife survey because that area has high potential for conservation, and I came across this gentleman with a muzzle loading gun that had been built by a local blacksmith, and he was out looking for deer and wild pig for the pot. Now, this sort of poaching of prey base or bushmeat poaching is extremely rampant in certain parts of India. It's there almost everywhere across India's tiger habitats, but in certain areas such as eastern central India and northeastern India, it is especially rampant. And this is a problem to the extent that in many high quality habitats, by the simple act of poaching the majority of the prey out, tiger populations have been decimated without much direct poaching, because once prey base is wiped out, the habitat becomes unsustainable for tigers to use. Tigresses can't bring up cubs because they can't provide enough food to them, and the local tigers begin to hunt livestock, which is more easily available and easy to hunt. And a lot of tigers get poisoned in retaliation by the owners of this livestock, and over time, whatever tigers survive will begin to abandon such habitats simply for the lack of prey. So bushmeat poaching is a major threat to the survival of tigers in India. Then, of course, there is the direct poaching of tigers, which is driven by a demand from Far Eastern markets and Southeast Asian markets. A lot of tigers in India have been decimated because of direct poaching. There are ups and downs in the rate at which tiger poaching has taken place across the tiger conservation history of India. So, say immediately after the notification of the Wildlife Protection Act, for a decade or two, tiger poaching had gone down. But then again, in the 1990s, there was a spurt. And then again, in the early 2000s, there was a spurt. As of now, tiger poaching is under much better control than it has been in the past. There are still instances of poaching that happen every now and then, and skins are seized, but it is nowhere near the scale of what it used to be earlier. So the previous challenges that I showed before talking about poaching now actually are greater challenges than the direct poaching of tigers. An increasing fallout of the fragmentation of tiger habitat and the local increase of tiger populations in in certain areas, especially around certain reserves, is that there is now increasing human-tiger conflict. Now, when tigers begin, when a reserve is well protected and it begins to saturate with tigers, tigers from that reserve need to be able to safely disperse out of there. For that, as I was mentioning earlier, it needs to be the reserve needs to have safe corridors that connect it to other habitats. In the absence of these corridors, there is an increasing amount of conflict that is happening across many parts of India, because tigers then become forced to enter human-dominated landscapes, which brings them into direct conflict with people. This leads often to the loss of a lot of livestock, for which, of course, in the better managed reserves and better managed landscapes, the owners of the livestock are compensated immediately. Cases of accidental killing of humans by tigers and humans by tigers, which is infamously referred to as man-eating, and which is a very rare phenomenon still. And it's still considered an aberration by, say, a very old or a very injured tiger. There are also cases of tigers getting killed or poisoned and even lynched in these cases of human-tiger conflict. In this photograph, you can see how this tiger has found itself in agricultural lands, and it probably was passing through the area at night and couldn't manage to, and at daybreak it was surrounded by mobs of thousands and thousands of people, which makes it very difficult for the forest department to control these scenarios. Now, another huge challenge that tiger conservation faces in India is that most tiger landscapes happen also to be landscapes that are the homes of India's indigenous people. Now, these people have traditionally been forest dwellers, and their lives have been intertwined with the forest. They were in the past, they were hunter-gatherers. There were also tribes that did some sort of settled agriculture in and around forests. And earlier, when India had a much lesser population of human beings, and the amount of habitat available for wildlife conservation for wildlife was much larger. This wasn't all that much of a problem. But today, unfortunately, the size of available tiger habitats is so small that it's become very difficult to find areas where you can have a sizable tract of tiger habitat to sustain a breeding tiger population, where also you can have indigenous communities living around that area. So to consolidate whatever remains of India's tiger habitats in order to make them viable for sustaining breeding tiger populations, it has become important to look at options of relocating some settlements, some human settlements in these areas to areas around. And this has also become a major socioeconomic sort of challenge for people living in these areas, because within protected areas, within wildlife sanctuaries and national parks and tiger reserves, it is by law impossible to provide basic modern amenities like roads, electricity, schools, hospitals, or any sort of, basic infrastructure to benefit people living in these areas. For this reason, India has a voluntary relocation program that is on offer to indigenous communities that happen to live within tiger habitats inside wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and tiger reserves. And under this program, if a family or a village wants to voluntarily move out of these habitats and come closer to mainstream society with access to schools and hospitals and markets, then the government compensates each family with over ₹1 million and a land for land settlement. And this has been a very successful model that has led to a lot of families moving out of very remote areas and coming closer to the benefits of the modern world. And at the same time, this has led to the consolidation of large tracts of tiger habitat, which is the reason behind the success of tiger conservation in India, despite all these challenges. So it is really a win-win model. Now, this slide here shows a typical forest village in a tiger habitat of central India, and you can see how paddy is being cultivated inside a tiger reserve. And once villages like these choose to relocate, these areas that are under cultivation are reverted back to natural meadows and grasslands, which help sustain those high densities of prey that we talked about earlier in the presentation, that in turn help sustain tigers. Now, there are still vast tracts of India, again, especially in eastern central India, where I'm from, and where I, in a lot of landscapes where I work for tiger conservation. In a lot of these landscapes, we have what are called silent forests. Now, these are forests that have excellent quality of habitat, but they hardly have any wildlife. That's because they have been so overhunted, and the bushmeat hunting has entirely or nearly entirely wiped out the large ungulate prey, causing tiger populations to have collapsed and gone locally extinct. Now, in areas like these, India is now experimenting quite successfully in most areas with the reintroduction of tigers. So this news item, for example, that I put on the slide, talks about a tiger from central India, where we go on safari with Nat Hab, being brought to a reserve called Satkosia, where I happen to work, as a matter of fact, and where I am the honorary wildlife warden. This reserve had become practically empty of tigers. There's just one last remaining tigress in that reserve, and there's no source population anywhere within reach of that reserve for it to be able to cause a natural revival of tigers. So after bringing up protection to acceptable standards, after the revival of prey base in that reserve, and after the relocation of villages from the core area of that reserve, tigers were brought in from central India to start a new population here. Now, in this particular case, it hasn't so far been successful, but there have been other examples across India where locally extinct tiger populations have been revived through successful tiger translocation. Now, for the success of any wildlife conservation measure in any democratic country, it is crucially important that civil society plays a strong role, an active role in the conservation of wildlife. Civil society in India has always been very active in tiger conservation, and that is one of the key reasons for the success of tiger conservation in particular and wildlife conservation in general in this country. In the past, especially in the early days, conservation was mostly having a top-down approach where it was an upper class concern and was imposed through the might of government. But thankfully, that has now changed and is changing fast. And tiger conservation has increasingly turned into a middle class and a popular public concern. And there is also, as I was mentioning, a high amount of involvement by non-governmental organizations and individuals in conservation that has helped make conservation such a success in this country. Besides, of course, a lot of interest from the courts and a lot of public interest litigations that have led to landmark decisions in wildlife conservation. Wildlife tourism, like it does across most of the world, plays a very important role in tiger conservation as well. Not only does it create employment opportunities and goodwill of people living around tiger reserves, people who would otherwise be looking for a livelihood from firewood collection or bushmeat poaching or forest produce collection or timber felling. Wildlife tourism also has helped garner a lot of public support. There has been a very visible and drastic increase in the popularity of wildlife tourism over the last 2 decades. I think personally, in my opinion, it has sort of coincided with the increase in digital, the introduction and increase in digital photography, which got a lot of people interested in wildlife photography and therefore in wildlife tourism. So it has become a major recreational activity for a lot of people across India who like to spend their holidays on safari in India's various national parks. Now, this has led to tremendous amounts of public support for tiger conservation. And wherever there is public support in large quantities, there is always an increase in political will. So wildlife tourism has played a direct role in improving political will for wildlife conservation and tiger conservation in India. That apart, besides the normal government allocation of funds that every reserve receives, there is also significant amounts of funds that these reserves generate from the sale of permits for wildlife tourism. and that directly helps in funding conservation activities. And of course, as I was mentioning earlier, there are many collateral benefits of tiger conservation. When you target the top carnivore or the top predator in any ecosystem, that automatically leads to the conservation of all the other species that are further down in the food chain. And as a result of tiger conservation, a lot of critically endangered species in India have benefited. Now, tiger conservation, as we discussed, faces a lot of challenges in India. But fortunately, there is constant effort both on behalf of the government and, of course, fueled by civil society to meet these challenges and overcome these challenges. A very famous authority on tiger conservation in India, a wildlife biologist called Dr. Ullas Karanth, has estimated that if all of India's tiger habitats can be given the same level of protection and management as some of our best tiger reserves are given, then India has the potential to be home to between 10,000 to 15,000 tigers, with the current amount of habitat that we have. I'd like to speak a little about the role that WWF has played in tiger conservation in India. WWF is involved in research and monitoring. It partners with the state forest departments in conducting various exercises like camera trapping exercises and line transit monitoring in all of India's tiger landscapes to monitor tigers and its co-predators like leopards and wild dogs, as well as prey base. And it is also involved in a lot of studies on tiger corridors. That apart, WWF is involved in mitigating human tiger conflict, in working with local communities across tiger habitats and corridors, in education and awareness programs, as well as policy and advocacy. WWF also supports tiger conservation through the Traffic India program that focuses on cracking down on wildlife crime. Now, if you would like to watch tigers in the wild, the best trips that I would suggest are all the India trips, the Grand India Wildlife Adventure, India Tiger Quest, and the upcoming Tiger Photo Pro expedition. The Grand India Wildlife Adventure takes you on a 12-day safari across India, across central India and northeastern India, where you get to spend time not only in some of India's finest tiger habitats, but also in the abode of the one-horned rhino and elephant that is Kaziranga National Park. And in the India Tiger Quest expedition, we traveled to Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, where incidentally this photograph was taken in the summer months, and that is one of the best trips to watch and photograph tigers in. And with that, I would like to end this presentation and ask Colby to open up the room for Q&A. And of course, if you would like to find out more about these trips, the link, phone number, and contact info are given below.
Okay, fantastic, Aditya. Thank you so much for sharing with us. This is absolutely fascinating. Before we start the Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your own questions via the questions field in your control panel. As always, some folks have been doing that all along. Aditya, why don't we start with a couple broader questions. How many national parks does India have? And are those parks all tiger reserves, or are the tiger reserves separate?
Well, India has about 700 protected areas in all. That includes wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. Not all of them are tiger reserves. 52 of them are tiger reserves, which doesn't mean that the others do not have tigers. Many of them do have tigers. Wildlife sanctuary, national park, tiger reserve, these are all different designations that can be given to the same area as well. So most tiger reserves also happen to be national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. The wildlife sanctuaries are notified by the respective state governments, which also fund them, while the national park and tiger reserve designation are given by the central or federal government, which give additional funds and call for more focused management of these areas.
Okay. You were talking about poaching. Can you tell us a little bit about the penalties for poaching? Are they severe? What happens to people that are caught?
They're very severe. India happens to have some of the strictest conservation legislation in the world. So the penalty for poaching a tiger or any other Schedule 1 species under the Wildlife Protection Act is the same as attempt to murder, which is half a life term. Now, a life term in India is limited to 14 years, and half a life term is 7 years. But there are challenges there. You see, while we have very strict legislation, unfortunately, the rate of conviction in wildlife poaching cases is very low because there seems to be a disconnect between the courts and facts on the ground, where judges seek often they seek evidence that is impossible to provide in remote areas such as these. Because, for example, there can't be witnesses when somebody is out in the forest poaching, and bails unfortunately are given very easily in most cases. So while these court cases and the initial arrests are major deterrents, it's very rare for somebody to actually be convicted and get a full term.
Very interesting. Some of the viewers, Aditya, picked up on your very casual and humble mention that you're an honorary game warden. Can you tell us a little bit about what that entails?
Well, in India, and I believe in some other countries like Kenya and South Africa and probably Indonesia, there is a system where private citizens who have credibility and who have spent time working on conservation can be nominated as the state by the state governments as honorary wildlife wardens. An honorary wildlife warden is given the same very similar powers to that of a serving forest or wildlife officer, and they are expected to work as a link between the government and the public and conservation concerns, and they're given some powers of law enforcement, such as the powers to search, seize, and arrest. And they're expected to advise the government on conservation matters and propose new areas to be brought under the protected areas network as wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, etc. So it's an honorary position, but it is one that carries a lot of responsibility.
Very cool. We appreciate you being out there. That's it is quite an honor, but it's also a very important job. So thank you for being out there. Let's see, a couple other questions about tigers for you, Aditya. So the tigers that are in these parks that we see on safari with you, have the tigers been habituated to those vehicles? How do they feel being around people?
Well, in these parks, these parks are areas that have remained undisturbed for years, and it has been observed that when these habitats become undisturbed, and by undisturbed I mean free of disturbance from persecution, from poaching, and from humans being around on foot all the time in the forest, it is found that a lot of the wildlife becomes diurnal. So say tigers in disturbed forests would be strictly nocturnal, but in these parks they feel absolutely safe to be out and about during the daytime. So and generations of them have been watching safari vehicles come and go. So a lot of these tigers do become very confident around safari vehicles, but they still retain their fear of the biped form. So there have been many cases that I can recollect where we have been parked next to a tiger, and the tiger has been absolutely at ease with 3 or 4 safari jeeps around, but a single forest guard walking down the same road half a kilometer away spooks the tiger, and the tiger just bolts and vanishes.
Okay. And you were talking about moving tigers from one reserve to another, and you mentioned that sometimes that fails. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Well, in of the 3 cases that I know of, one has been a fantastic success, where a tiger reserve in central India, where the local tiger population came down from about 40 animals in the early 2000s to 0 in 2005. And through reintroduction, that number is now over 60, and tigers in that reserve are spilling out, and it's become saturated with tigers. There was another case in a reserve called Sareska close to Delhi, where also the local tiger population went extinct, and tigers were reintroduced. The reintroduced tigers in that reserve have managed to settle down, but they haven't rebounded at the same pace that the tigers in the first reserve did. But they're breeding, but they still haven't bounced back at that rate. And then there is the reserve where I work as honorary wildlife warden, called Satkosia, where the first 2 tigers that were brought in, one of them got caught in a snare, a poacher snare, and died, while the other actually started frequenting the human-dominated parts of the reserve and ended up killing 2 people. And that meant that she had to be caught and put back in an enclosure. So in that reserve, the tiger reintroduction exercise has been shelved for the moment until things can be improved further on the ground. So the success of tiger reintroduction depends entirely upon how well the reintroduction site has been prepared for receiving tigers once again, and how competent the staff and the managers in that reserve are.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. A last question about the pandemic. Has the pandemic affected tiger preservation efforts, or what other effects have you seen thanks to COVID-19?
Well, so far it hasn't. It doesn't seem to have affected things directly or significantly. Of course, the pandemic has dealt a huge blow to the tourism industry, and international tourism does not exist in India at the moment. But there is still a significant amount of domestic tourism that has helped keep a lot of these people who live and work around the reserves employed. We've had 2 waves of the pandemic in the country now, and during both waves, even domestic tourism had gone down, but fortunately things seem to be bouncing back. and as of now, things are looking fairly good.
Well, that's great news. I know we're all excited to get over there with you to participate in some of these wonderful trips that you're leading. That's the last question we have for today, folks. With that, Aditya, would you like to share a few closing comments with everyone?
I'd like to thank everybody for coming and listening to this presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it and that it answered a lot of your questions about tiger conservation. And I look forward to joining you again soon. 26th August is my next webinar, and I promise not to talk about tigers in that one.
Well, we certainly don't mind, and I can say thank you on behalf of everyone. The Q&A right now is blowing up with people thanking you for a wonderful presentation. Another great job, very cool, Aditya, and thank you for sharing about conservation. I will echo that. Thank you for taking the time with us today. And I would like to also thank everyone who tuned in. Join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and as always, we'll have the replay available on our website shortly. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Thank you, everyone.